first. Welcome, first of all.
Hey, nice to be back. By the way, Daniel Dennett, who's number 4 in our Four Horsemen of the Counter-Apocalypse.
Yes.
Doesn't end in S, but still, nice try.
And Ian McEwan gets main credit for your book, actually, doesn't he?
He does, yes. It's I dedicated it to him because over the years he's been a tremendous ally in the sense of someone with whom one can carry on a really intelligent conversation.
As you say, he helps you understand the difference between the numinous and the...
Yes. A lot of people say, well, atheism is rather arid. After all, it defines itself as a negative, as something you don't believe or something you are not. And where's the magic? Where's the charm in this? Whereas at least religion has this magnificence and this, transcendence. And I say, well, the transcendent is fine. And the numinous is fine. And we can't do without it. We need poetry, we need architecture, we need music, we need love. But there's a big distinction between that and the supernatural. And the brilliant way that Ian registers this in his fiction, I'm sure perhaps more than usually your listeners are reading him because of atonement, is to...
Which is a very religious-sounding word, of course.
Extremely, even if you're not from our tradition, is that he patrols that frontier between the supernatural and the numinous very well and enforces the distinction with great skill, I think.
Speaking of religion, and we will speak a good deal of religion with you, of course, this morning, but I read a piece you did about Mrs. Budo. First of all, can we surmise that religion is behind this? That, in other words, certainly one gets a sense at this point that Musharraf and company are trying to blame al-Qaeda. They have done so. There's some speculation, I don't think anybody really knows, that maybe the Budo assassination had perhaps something to do with Musharraf wanting to keep his power or consolidate his power?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I'm not a fan of the generals, but I can't see any way in which he could be glad this has happened. It's a disaster for him. If a candidate in an election is murdered in the headquarters of the Pakistani military, the garrison town, Rawalpindi, it's partly a challenge to Musharraf. These are people trying to show you don't run this place. You know, it is a direct affront to his power, to his authority, and he must be feeling it. And he can't want the streets of Rawalpindi and Karachi and Islamabad to be on fire, which is a prediction anyone could have made. No, the people who most wanted her dead, most needed her dead, most announced that they would kill her, and were identified by her as the ones who she thought would do it, are the Islamic extremists.
So nobody
call them Al-Qaeda if you like.
No, from that group, and the government has not allowed them to exhume her body. Why do you suppose that?
By the way, claiming credit is a grotesque way of putting it, isn't it? When you think about it.
Well,
we say that.
Yeah, it's appropriate though for what they want in terms of.
I suppose yes. They haven't boasted of it. They haven't bragged of it. And there's nothing to say that it wasn't a lone nutcase.
Yeah.
But if it was a lone nutcase, it would have been a lone religious nutcase, is I guess what I'm saying.
Any thoughts as why the government won't allow an autopsy?
No, unless that too is a sop to the Islamists, because the tradition in Islam is that the body is buried as soon as can possibly be. And there's always been a difficulty with the autopsy in this case. It does seem bizarre. Have you seen the video? The most recent
I have not.
one? No, you can't really tell from it whether the claim that the fatal injury was in fact a fractured skull from banging her head rather than from the shrapnel or the bullets. One can't tell whether that claim is vindicated or not, nor whether it would make any difference.
We know nothing about the son, who's being named now as a possible successor. They want to go ahead with the election, her party said, on January 8th. And the fact of the matter is he's 19 years old. He has really no experience.
No, this is in the worst tradition of subcontinental personality and populist politics. I mean, the Pakistan People's Party, PPP, has always been a private fiefdom of the Bhutto family. It's never really had an internal election of any kind. It's never chosen a leader. It's just a vehicle for the Bhuttos. But it is rather grotesque that this completely untried, literally unheard of 19-year-old is stepping forward. I noticed his first remark was his mother used to say democracy is the best revenge. Well, in that case, this isn't a good revenge because it's not democratic.
Talking again with Christopher Hitchens. I read a piece you did in Slate about Mrs. Budo, and you talked about her bravery, her physical courage particularly. You also said she has the largest electric complex of any female politician in modern history, which I think is probably quite accurate. But and I liked and admired her. I'd interviewed her a number of times. She had charm. She had a kind of brilliance and wit.
Yes, she was quite captivating. I remember when I used to know her slightly, and she had me to speak at the Oxford Union when she was president there, and was rather bewitching. And then I drove around with her alone the night she became prime minister, the night she won the election in November 1988. And I was absolutely astounded by how brave she was, just without a bodyguard, in a jeep, with only me, driving through these slums of Karachi where anything can happen. It's one of the most dangerous cities in the world. And she would stop the truck and poke up through the sunroof, standing on the seat, just exactly as she did last week in Rawalpindi, with a bullhorn, and just address the people, who were very enthusiastic, I must say, but among whom there could have been lurking any number of goons.
Where's the line between bravery and recklessness?
Well, that's the thing. You see, I think there's an element of, when I came to reconsider it, and after I'd interviewed her a few times, there's an element of fanaticism in her courage. It was all to do with ambition, which was enormous in her case, and the electoral complex that you mentioned. I mean, if ever I've met someone whose heart belongs to Daddy, it was her. Her father had been cruelly executed by General Zia, it's true, but I mean, she lived to vindicate her father. She absolutely worshipped him. Nothing he ever did could have been wrong. This is the man who said, the people of Pakistan will eat grass rather than give up their desire for a nuclear weapon.
It was prescient in some ways, wasn't it?
Yes, because they've now got a nuke and a lot of them are eating grass, so he was dead right about that. She lied to me very directly about the intentions of Pakistan's nuclear program. I could tell she was lying too. I didn't know then, it was all in the future, that she would become Pakistan's patron of the Taliban in Afghanistan next door. The Russians were still in Afghanistan at the time I'm talking about. So the Taliban was in the future, but she did play a mean game with them, which didn't get pointed out enough last week. But I think she learned from that experience.
The electric complex didn't extend to the husband?
No. I mean, the husband was arranged for her. She passively let her family pick this playboy as husband. Rather odd for someone who was so ostensibly, not exactly feminist, but emancipated. I mean, she would wear a scarf, but she never covered her face, and she was very forward and very fashionable. She let them just...
On radio, she didn't have a scarf.
She just let them pick a scarf made for radio, yes. She just let them pick a husband for her. I think partly because he was from the province of Sindh, which is where she's from, which incidentally is very important because much of Pakistan's elite, especially including its army, is from the Punjab, is Punjabi. Pakistan is a state dominated by one province. And the fact that she is from the second largest province, Sindh, and has a power base there too, plus some appeal in Punjab, is politically something you have to understand if you want to know how Pakistan functions.
Talking again with Christopher Hitchens, she was, when it came to corruption charges and those things thrown at her, she did get, as you pointed out in the Slate article, self-righteous and kind of hauteurish.
Yes, she did. And I suppose it's completely possible she thought all that was beneath her. I mean, she had, by the time she got to Oxford, people would joke because she'd never had to open a door, or probably even open a car door, or pull a curtain, or even get the top off a bottle. I mean, everything had always been done for her. The very adoring Daddy again. And I think she may well have just not inquired where the money came from. There's always enough money somehow. Who cares where it comes from? And not asked her husband what he was doing with his spare time. Was he asking 10% from any foreign company that wanted to do business in Pakistan? She might have thought it was all beneath her and just disdained it. I don't care as long as the money keeps coming. Possible. But that's one definition of corruption, is indifference.
Could have been passed on to the son, too.
Yes. Anyway, it doesn't and didn't look good. I mean, the Swiss courts have found against her on this. That's all I know for sure. John Burns of the New York Times did do a very good background piece in the New York Times about 10 years ago, which I remember thinking at the time, and he's the best reporter perhaps in the world, certainly the Times has got. I remember thinking it made it very difficult to believe that she was all unaware of what was going on.
You have taken a lot of heat in the last 4 years or so since the Iraq War and your position on the Iraq War. And you did a piece, in fact, 4 years later, it was published in Slate in March, which essentially said, I still felt I was right. And let me talk about this with you because the second half of 2007 saw the violence drop dramatically in Iraq, and progress, however, came at a pretty high price because the year was the deadliest for the U.S. military since the invasion, back when 899 troops were killed. And yet there seems to be this argument, and I think to some extent it's an argument that you hold forth, that, well, there's evidence of it, more are breaking away from al-Qaeda and from the insurgency, that there is a sense of progress being made, real progress being made. Petraeus has been saying this. The administration has been saying this. I mean, this is pretty much how you read things, isn't it?
Yes, and that's why I was in favor of the surge at the time, because, look, let's separate one thing out from all the disappointments and blunders and indeed crimes of the occupation. Separate just one thing out that's very important. We have inflicted a battlefield defeat on the forces of al-Qaeda in a keystone Muslim Arab state. I don't think it's possible to overestimate the importance of that. They decided to make Iraq the country of their big push, of their major effort.
So forgive me, Bush was right, fight him there rather than fight him elsewhere?
Well, no, I would say fight him everywhere. But I mean, if they pick Iraq as the frontline country, and remember, they were there before we were. There are some people who say they wouldn't have been doing this if we weren't there. That's not true. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the deadliest al-Qaeda person after bin Laden, in some ways deadlier than him, was in Iraq before we got there. That's one of the very few things Colin Powell got right in his presentation to the United Nations. And clearly had an alliance with the Ba'ath Party. It still, as al-Qaeda in Iraq still does. It's not just that we've defeated them militarily, and since you mentioned casualty figures, the estimate is about 4,000 al-Qaeda militants this year dead or neutralized in some other way. I think that's a very impressive figure. I wish it was larger. It'll get bigger. It's not just a battlefield defeat. They've been discredited in front of the Iraqi population, who got to see what they were like when they briefly tried to set up an Islamic Republic in Anbar province and elsewhere, who turned on them, who've rejected them, repudiated them, who've come to the United States and said, we'd like to help you beat them. This is a crushing defeat for the forces of Islamic fundamentalism. And a very, very impressive feat of arms by our tremendous armed forces, who I'd be very proud to have seen in action doing this. Now, I just want to make a point to any liberals who are listening. If their advice had been followed, and we'd begun to announce a withdrawal, say, around the time Cindy Sheehan was demanding it, or any of the other times you can think of, al-Qaeda would now be saying that they drove us out of Iraq, and they'd be right. They would be celebrating a military victory and political victory over the United States of America in a keystone state on the Gulf, which is a choke point of the world economy. Al-Qaeda would be saying, you see, they left like we told you they would, and we can claim credit.
Just like Somalia.
Zarqawi would still be alive. It would be like Somalia, except cubed and squared. Somalia is a relatively marginal country. Iraq is an absolutely central one. It's the keystone between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and it's a choke point on the Gulf. This would have been an unprecedented disaster for civilization, and it's what the American left was demanding. I think that deserves to be rubbed in. And people say, I owe an explanation for what I've said. I'm sorry. It's the other side who owes the explanation.
They'll never forgive you. They'll never forgive you, particularly for alliances with neocons, right? I mean, that's the biggest sin of all,
I'd rather be a friend of Paul Wolfowitz than an apologist for Saddam Hussein.
What now, as far as Christopher Hitchens sees things?
What now in Iraq?
Yeah.
Well, there are three things. When people say they want the war to end, I always ask them, well, which war is that? There's the war against al-Qaeda, which I don't think we can possibly call off. There's the civil war within Iraq, the war within the war, the fight between different groups of Shia, between Shia and Sunni, and different groups of Sunni, and there's the fight to maintain and defend the great, unarguable gain of the war, which is the autonomy and freedom of Kurdistan, the success story, the northern quarter of the country, where there hasn't been any violence and where there's cooperation and prosperity and democracy and secularism and so forth. Well, the Kurdish thing is continuing to go very well. The war against Al-Qaeda is going better than I would have believed it would. The great disappointment is the very mediocre character of the political leadership in Baghdad. I mean, Saddam Hussein totally denuded and demoralized Iraqi society, and there isn't a political class. There's barely a vestigial political class there yet. And the people members of it are, on the whole, not very distinguished. That's the big disappointment. That's going to take a lot of time.
Where does that leadership come from?
Well, in default of what one might call or hope for as a serious political class, what you're going to get, what we tend to get, is people who can't think beyond their own sect or their own tribe.
Speaking of which, good segue to what I said we would talk about initially, which is religion and its role in this presidential election. It's become integral, hasn't it?
Well, it has in Iowa, at any rate, yes. But that's because I'm not just like to say a quick word about my newest column for the Slate, the one that's coming up next, is the absolute scandal of letting Iowa determine all these things for us. I mean, every 4 years, we in the journalistic profession say we're not going to do this again. We're not going to act as if Iowa was really an election or as if it was really a primary. We know it's only a party caucus. We know there's no secret ballot. We know it's not one person, one vote. We know all this, but every year we fail to swear off. And now it's all happened again. And you read, Mr. Huckabee is surging, right? And then finally, in a tiny paragraph in the New York Times profile of him, it says, I'll underline this, he surged because he appeals to about one half of 45% of 80,000 Republican registered voters in Iowa, a small, white, landlocked state. Now, I'll say it again. About one half, that's the evangelical half, of about 45%, which is the evangelical half, of 85 to 80,000 voters. That's it. And he manages to do that, and it's a surge. And we all cover it as if there'd been a huge election and a groundswell in Iowa. This is a scandal, and it's designed to promote freaks and fruit bats and marginal candidates like Huckabee.
Although, let me...
Imagine if the people of San Francisco or Chicago or Atlanta or Dallas were having a primary now. Do you think you'd ever have heard of Governor Huckabee?
No, but...
Even among the Republicans,
let's recast this in another fashion, though. The Republicans... we're looking, I would argue, the GOP is looking for a candidate whom they could serve up as religious enough. Somehow, Giuliani doesn't pass that litmus test because of his stand on social issues and because of his divorces and all that. Certainly, a Mormon doesn't pass the litmus test with the evangelicals and the Baptists and so forth. And the fact of the matter is that Huckabee does. He's a preacher. He's got all the moral equivalence of someone that perhaps that part of the Republican Party is looking for, and he speaks to those people, doesn't he?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And indeed, the field was so lousy for them a few months ago that if you remember, who's that idiot who runs Focus on the Family? Reverend Dobson.
James Dobson, yeah.
James Dobson, wonderful bumper sticker I saw once that said, "Focus on your own damn family." Was saying publicly they might have to run an independent candidate this year, people like him. There was no home for them in the Republican Party. Now, fine. I know that they should have their place and say in the Republican Party. Nobody denies it. But that Huckabee should be described as very nearly the front runner from nowhere, from nothing, is a function only of the positively anti-democratic influence of the Iowa caucuses. That's what I'm saying.
Is it also the fact that he's...
It's not. It isn't. If you took any other, if it was just the people of Iowa, not just this absurd caucus process, just the people of Iowa and the Republicans amongst them who were being consulted and were having a secret ballot, one person, one vote primary election, it wouldn't be Huckabee. It wouldn't be someone who doesn't believe, he says, in Darwin's theory of evolution, and when asked what he doesn't like about it, proves that he doesn't know what it is. He's so ignorant.
If it were New Hampshire, it wouldn't be Huckabee, for example, right?
I'd really very much doubt it.
Yeah.
So this is a part of the Iowa distortion effect that I think is having a terrible effect, has always had a terrible effect on our politics, and really needs to be rejected.
But he may be the only candidate for the religious right at this point, and also has the distinction of being a former governor of Arkansas, which
yes, and indeed, and from the fine
brings to
old
mind
town
your
of
friend Bill Clinton,
and from the fine old town of Hope
yes.
at that. Yes. No, well, I agree with you that there doesn't look to be now another plausible evangelical candidate, but it is still absurd that he is treated by our profession as if he was seriously gaining in public opinion.
What about gaining a public opinion in the Democratic Party through emphasizing religion? There's been an attempt by Obama and Clinton, as well as Edwards, to emphasize their sort of Sunday school notion of religiosity and their devoutness and piety and all those things.
Yes, Mrs. Clinton said that was what got her through the impeachment of her husband crisis. Of course, it's what got him through as well, if you remember. He carried a Bible around every single day of that trial.
And consulted with Jesse Jackson.
Hasn't been seen carrying it since, but Jesse Jackson, and of course, don't forget, always had Billy Graham on his side as well. Clearly, because of the alleged, I think, overrated effect of Karl Rove and the evangelical vote, the Democrats have decided that the way to pitch on this so-called red state, blue state divide, which is another thing I think is greatly overstated, is to be more pious. I think that they're changing ships on a falling tide. At least I certainly hope so. I think there's some reason to think it. The fastest growing group.
You hope and pray. Oh no, I'm sorry.
The fastest growing group of people in this country is the unbelieving group, those who have no religious affiliation. It's twice as big as it was when it was last polled. It's the most rapidly growing according to all the research. People, not atheists like myself, we're still a very small minority, but people who say they have no religious affiliation. And you would not know that this group of about 40 million people or so, quite a large group, existed if you went by the average discourse in politics and in the media. It is assumed that everyone wants to hear how often you go to church.
Many of those people like Ron Paul, but that's a whole other topic. I'm going to open the phone lines, in fact.
Many of them like Ayn Rand, it's true. Yes.
Coming about a break here. And if you want to talk with Christopher Hitchens, an excellent opportunity to do so. We're talking about Pakistan, about Iraq, and about the presidential election, particularly about religion and its role in it. You can join us toll-free, 866-733-6786. Again, that's toll-free, 866-733-6786, or by email, forum@kqed.org. This is Forum. I'm Michael Krasny. Just ask Christopher Hitchens a question off air. Jefferson and Orwell, the two men you admire the most because you have made mince out of so many historical figures, both male and female. I'm looking for people that you have given
oh, I see what you mean now. Well, yeah,
enshrinement to.
Yes, there was a time when motherly ladies in bookstores, when I did readings, would sort of come up to me anxiously and say, well, you seem like quite a nice guy and quite friendly, but we would be so worried we were afraid there was no one you liked. And because I suppose I had written quite a few polemics against people like Mother Teresa and Henry Kissinger and other sort of unsavory characters. So
excuse me, Mother Teresa turns out to be as faithless as you, though.
Yes, it turns out she couldn't bring herself to believe it either, which is one of the great discoveries of last year. But anyway, I guess I now do have an answer to that, in that I have written books in defense of George Orwell, Thomas Jefferson, and published this year Thomas Paine.
That's right. I read that book.
I try not to have heroes, and I think the hero-worshipping tendency needs to be kept under control in individuals and in the species in general. But these are people who restore one's faith in, or confirm perhaps, one's faith in human nature. Not that I don't have a lot of shade as well as light in my book on Jefferson. I mean, there are some inescapably horrible things about him.
Yeah, and I think you're very fair to Jefferson. There are certainly Christopher Hitchens admirers, many of them, but also the detractors. And if you judge a man by his enemies, as the old saw has it, I wonder about, you have them on both sides. I mean, I was reading some of the people who have gone after you, ranting about you, the way you rant about others, if I can use that verb, maybe a little bit.
Prefer not.
All right. Well,
no, I don't think I do rant. I think I'm of course, well, you be the judge. Polemicist is fine.
Yeah, let's say polemicize then. But there are some who rant against you. And I wonder about the fact that they've chosen to do, I mean, Coburn, Finkelstein, many of them on the left, but also Daniel Pipes and people who would be more seen in the conservative camp as well.
I didn't know Pipes had written anything about me. It's certainly true, as I know from my many, many years on the left, that there's a sort of culture of betrayal, I suppose. I mean, people on the left are very alert to the
apostasy.
Yes, to the thought of the sellout. And the sort of unspoken, well, not always unspoken assumption is if you leave the left, or if you break with it or quarrel with it, it must be for the lowest motive. It must be because you want a better job or
opportunism.
Yeah. Essentially, yes, it's a sellout. And it's very, very much. I used to do it myself. I would always look for the lowest motive for someone who'd broken with the comrades, and so I know what these guys are going through, and I sort of knew what to expect.
Some of the language, though, seems to me to be intemperate and pretty ad hominem. I was reading Finkelstein's piece, and corpulent opportunist, I think was the phrase, but also psychopath.
I don't read Finkelstein's stuff, but someone told me that on his blog he'd
It
said
was a blog,
he said he would welcome the news of my demise. Then apparently he went back and took that out, thought better of it, but this is clearly more than an ordinary dislike. As for the corpulence, I could stand to lose a few pounds, but I'm not. I mean, it's not. You can see me now. I mean, I'm not insultingly large.
It's hardly.
But I could be larger, and my opinions would still be the same.
Does this sort of stuff, though, galvanize
my convictions,
you?
I
Does
should
it
say.
fire you up?
No.
You don't.
Look, it takes a lot to make me cry, for one thing, and I have a fairly...
Well, that's not what I was asking. I was asking if it adds fodder to you, really, or it's grist for your mill, or you like the engagement of it.
Actually, no, that stuff rather depresses me, for the reason that I just gave you, in that I'm very familiar with it as a trope of accusations of sellout from the left. It reminds me of some things I've said myself in the past that I don't very much admire myself for having said or thought. And no, it doesn't really, it's not the sort of thing you can strike many sparks off. In order for a conversation or an argument to be well conducted and for people to improve their own style in doing it, taking part in it, the level has to be reasonably high.
Let's go to our callers and find out what they have to ask or say. Ed, you're first. Good morning.
Good morning. I'd like to ask Chris a question about Iraq, but before that, I've been following his writing for the last several years. He comes across as very disgenuine and uncredible. And the fact is, all of us knew when Bush came in power with this crowd, Wolfowitz and Perr and Strauss and neocons, what we would expect. The whole war was based on lies, and more lies and more lies and lies. And Chris, instead of standing for these people, he went along with them, so he must have a benefit of it. I'd like to ask him, is he a Straussian? The German philosophers that came and really basically hijacked the U.S. policy for the last 30 years, starting from Reagan time. And also, if he really does believe what he says, he must have the blood of all of these dead Americans, almost 100,000 dead and wounded, and over a million Iraqis dead and wounded. My question to him, what should we do since you have beaten the drums to war to Iraq? And I attended one of your lectures at UC Berkeley, and I stood up and asked you a question, which you basically gave me a not very good gesture with your finger. Let me ask you, what should we do, Chris, after all of the damage that I could have by convincing you and other Straussian to stop this so-called war? Excuse me.
Let's get a response here because we're getting a little filibusterish. Are you a Straussian, first of all?
No. I mean, and just for those who may not understand the question, Leo Strauss was a German Jewish exile philosopher who came first to the New School in New York, right?
That's right.
Do sometimes teach, where I'm a visiting professor, and then eventually settled in Chicago. And he's best known for his theory of the esoteric reading of philosophical works, in an attempt to discover what the philosophers were trying to communicate to the adept, to the initiated.
He was adopted by the neocons, though, as
notably Machiavelli. Well, he taught some of them, and was a very much beloved philosophical instructor to many people. There isn't really. It's very, very difficult to derive any politics from Strauss. I'm not very familiar with his work. There's one extremely good essay that I do know quite well called Persecution in the Art of Writing, which is about how down the years many writers have learned how to evade censorship by writing in such a way that the censor doesn't quite realize what it is that they're saying. It gets it past them with sort of literary ingenuity. It's a very well-turned essay. And because he deals in these arcana, many people have a kind of conspiratorial view of what his influence really is, which is a vulgar misrepresentation. If it's really true that I greeted a question at a lecture of mine with a manual gesture, I suppose I should apologize. I must have been provoked by something more than that.
Did you do that on Maher too, though?
I was being booed and jeered at by a crowd. I just flip them off, yes. But I mean, I hate those little mini Nurembergs. I've said to both Maher and to John Stewart, why don't you try me one day without your cheering section, just you and me, and we'll see who wins the argument. Then there'd be no need to go manual. As to the lying us into war and so on, well, everyone knows how that argument goes. I think it's a second-order question. I don't think the allegations about weapons of mass destruction were fabricated. Okay, I think it was the sane assumption to make of a regime that had used weapons of mass destruction, had an entire ministry devoted to their concealment, had been caught many times lying to the UN inspectors and concealing things from them, that they didn't deserve any presumption of innocence, that they weren't entitled to the benefit of any doubt, that the rational assumption to make was that they were concealing weaponry.
But you did say that Secretary Powell's performance, dog and pony show, I think you called it, the UN, was a disgrace.
It was terrible, yes. It was shabby and shameful, and it shows something that we already knew, actually, and have recently had confirmed yet again. Our CIA is useless to us. It's worse than not having an intelligence agency at all, is to have one that's politicized and corrupt and incompetent. My line has been, I changed my mind on Iraq during the first Gulf War. If you really separate them into two, I actually think the war that started in 91 didn't really end until 2003. Yeah, I was very much opposed to it. I spent a lot of time out there. By the end of it, I changed my mind. I thought we should have ended it by removing Saddam Hussein. And that the big mistake was to leave him in power, was not to take care of this in 1991. 92.
Of course, the first time we met, you were an advocate and a strong spokesman for the Kurds. You had done a book on the Kurds. I mean, this goes way back. In terms of your own pedigree with respect to Iraq and your concern about the Kurds, it had a lot to do with your hatred of Saddam.
Yes, seeing the attempted genocide of the Kurdish people of northern Iraq and seeing the unbelievable cruelty and violence of that regime at first hand in the 90s did make me decide that ultimately, essentially, our existence and the existence of Saddam Hussein's regime were incompatible. I mean, he had to go. And I've been looking for an occasion to get rid of him for a long, long time.
It's quite possible now, in retrospect, isn't it, that Saddam was pulling a major kind of poker bluff with WMDs, fooling the Iranians and the Americans into thinking that he had what he really didn't have?
Strategic ambiguity must have been part of it, and it may also have been a vice of his regime, which was so hermetic and so fascistic and based so much on pure fear that there may be no one in his secret police or in his scientific community who was willing to tell him that there really wasn't much left of the deposits of WMD that they certainly had, and certainly had been maintaining, and certainly had been concealing from inspectors. So he may have thought he had more than he did. He certainly knew that they were lying, because that was always their habit. So, in effect, let's just put it like this. Don't want to sound cynical. Iraq has been disarmed by the intervention, because now it can be certified as in compliance with United Nations resolutions. And it couldn't have been before. And it was compliance with the resolutions that was the issue, and they were never going to comply.
Talking again, if you've just joined us, with Christopher Hitchens, and he is...
By the way, it also seems that later that year the Iranians halted their own program, and we know that the Libyans gave theirs up as a result of the Iraq intervention, or partly as a result of it. And we know that as a result of the analysis of what Libya had, which was a lot more than anyone had suspected, it was worse than we thought, we were able to walk back the cat and unmask the AQ Khan, Nukes Are Us Walmart in Pakistan. And also to unmask a lot of what had been going on in North Korea. So in non-proliferation terms, the Iraq operation must be accounted a huge success. I'm serious.
Again, talking to Christopher Hitchens. His newest books are God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, and The Portable Atheist, Essential Readings for the Non-Believer. And when he says, by the way, when you say our CIA, I should mention you did become an American citizen, lest anybody assume that you're still...
Indeed, yes. On this year, Jefferson's birthday, April 13th.
Michael, you're on the air. Good morning.
Good morning. I just wanted to ask Mr. Hitchens if he had read Kevin Phillips' American Theocracy, and if so, if you had any comments on that. And if you give me 20 more seconds, I could mention a couple of things regarding your discussion?
Yeah, sure. But though I should mention, you can find an interview that we did with that I did with Kevin Phillips on American Theocracy.
Oh yeah, no, I heard it. That was great. I just wondered,
No, I
following
haven't.
on that, political virtue versus Christian virtue, a la Montesquieu, if Mr. Hitchens is familiar with that. Also, you mentioned the recklessness versus courage of Bhutto. Seems to me recklessness. Then the surge, I believe, has created more problems than overall than it's helped. Well, I'll let you guys. I'll let you guys go.
You're giving us a kind of pastiche.
That's sort of a bit free associating. No, I haven't read Mr. Phillips's work.
You read Montesquieu, though, I'm sure.
Yes, I have. I've read The Spirit of the Laws a long time ago. I don't think much of Mr. Phillips.
Because?
Never did, really. There's a certain kind of populism about him that depresses me. And its counterpart, or frequent counterpart, which is a sort of conspiratorialism. From the reviews of that book, it seemed to me that he was at it again. But I shouldn't really say, having not read it. I think it'd be...
Well, he does go after the Bush family, and he not only goes after the Bush family, he goes after the kind of thing that you go after, because he's quite condemnatory of how theocratic and religious, has become too much involved and colluded into politics.
Well, I certainly think that...
This is a former Republican, we should mention.
Yes, I have a feeling.
The Reagan administration.
I think the reason why James Dobson was as pessimistic as he was, this is before this pseudo-Huckabee, pseudo-surge we were just talking about, was that the evangelical community and the Christian right, of course, had a very bad year. Not just the loss of the ridiculous Jerry Falwell, but the real failure of them to get the Republicans to enact any of their program. That's because it's unpopular. It's because people don't want it. And one of the points, I think, at which the tide probably began to turn was President Bush's ridiculous, well, no, it's more ridiculous, contemptible intervention in the private life of the Shivo family, I believe. I think the outrageous way that he left his farm, which it takes a lot to make him do, to intervene at the bedside of a woman who had, in fact, already clinically died, and to interfere in the Shivo family's private arrangements. That was the point at which I think a lot of Americans thought, that's it, enough is enough. So if that's the sort of thing Kevin Phillips is denouncing, then more power to his elbow.
Here's a listener, a question for Mr. Hitchens. If we can agree that we do not know as a matter of absolute fact that God does not exist, why is it necessary or important to you that you identify as an atheist? That is, one who espouses certainty about the non-existence of God rather than an agnostic, one who is uncertain about the existence of God. In other words, why is it important to you to counter one false claim to certainty with your own false claim to certainty? This does not mean that you should take the claims of theists seriously, but when engaging in such a volatile conversation, it may be wise to admit to the limits of your own knowledge.
Yeah, that's a brilliantly phrased question, I must say. Congratulations. Well, I think I can answer it deftly enough. First, there's the difference between deism and theism. To say that there is no God, in other words, no presiding, perhaps originating or creating force, is beyond anyone's capacity. We cannot say we know that's not so. But someone who thinks it is so, or that it might be so, still has all their work ahead of them, because to be a theist, you have to say that you know the mind of God, that you know what he wants, you know what he wants you to eat, who he wants you to go to bed with or not, whether he answers prayers, yes, whether he intervenes in human affairs. That's the difference between a deist and a theist position. Now, I think the reason why it's important to me to say no is this. If you concede the theist position, that there is a God who answers prayers, intervenes in human affairs, and then the next thing you're going to find is that human beings are going to be telling you what to do in the name of God.
Which is why you call yourself an atheist as well as an anti-theist.
Yes, I say I'm an anti-theist. I say I'm very glad there's no basis for this belief. The atheist position is there is no reason to think it is true, which means that we may discard it. I would add it's a very good thing it's not true, because it would be awful if it were, in that we would be living under an unalterable celestial dictatorship that could read our thoughts while we were asleep and convict us of thought crime, and could pursue us after we were dead. And in the name of which priesthoods and other oligarchies and hierarchies would be set up to enforce God's law, which is, of course, exactly what does happen if you concede the proposition. So the beginning of the struggle for human emancipation, in my opinion, which is why I recommend The Portable Atheist so highly to you, because it shows how this argument goes back to the dawn of history. The original human emancipation is the emancipation from the idea of a celestial dictatorship.
Well, who's this famous British atheist who just recanted and said that he's found faith, or he's...
There is a celebrated, well, reasonably celebrated English academic called Anthony Flew, F-L-E-W, who has, for the last 10 years of his... I was about to make an ad hominem remark, who, in his dotage, actually, I think I may as well just come right out and say it, has been every year changing his mind, to and from, back and forth, against the existence of God. I think this last time he said he thought there was a God. I think it's incredibly unlikely that he knows. Yeah. Yes, I strongly recommend Anthony Gottlieb's review of his book in the New York Times Book Review.
There's a listener named Zeus who says,
fair enough.
I don't believe I've ever heard Christopher Hitchens ever admit he was substantially wrong on any issue. It appears he is the same kind of faith-based fundamentalist he accuses others of being.
Well, it wouldn't be faith-based if I considered myself to be infallible, which of course I don't. My favorite time is the interval of time between the death of a pope and the choosing of a new one. I always want it to go on as long as possible, because in that period there's no human being who can be infallible, and I always feel that that's a great little interval.
But what comes to mind?
By the way, I would certainly,
when were you wrong?
By the way, I would certainly say I was wrong to have opposed the war to liberate Kuwait from Saddam Hussein. I can hardly believe I did that now. I can remember what the arguments were, and I can remember making them as well as I could, which I like to think wasn't too badly. But I had it all backwards on that.
What does Mr. Hitchens think about the risks of arming of the Sunni in Iraq and doing so without the sanction of the government?
Well, I think they're very considerable risks. It's not exactly without the sanction of the government. The government is in favor of the Anbar awakening, but it is obviously, as any government would have to be, leery of the creation of armed forces that challenge its own monopoly of violence. The thing about Iraq is that no one has a monopoly of violence. The United States doesn't have one, but it's the nearest to having one. That means, by definition, the Iraqi government isn't the one that has the monopoly, which must make it feel insecure. Given the sectarian character of the society, there's a zero-sum element, unfortunately, involved. Any gain by any community can be viewed as being at the expense of the other. That's the curse of Iraqi politics.
On we go. Debbie, join us. You're on.
Oh, hello, Mr. Hitchens, from a fellow atheist. I just have one little question before I ask my big question. Have you and Graydon Carter kissed and made up yet?
Well, we never had anything to kiss and make up about.
Well, in some of his editorials in the beginning, he, a couple of years ago, had mentioned that you guys had a rift. And I was just wondering if the rift was... I don't
remember it. I mean, we've had a very strong public disagreement.
Yes, I know.
On the war in Iraq.
Yes.
But he has never prevented me from publishing. So contrary to me, he's very often, several times paid for me to go to Iraq and report to the contrary of his own opinion. Good, right. To his credit, I think.
Obviously, your rift has been mended. My question to you is,
I guess there was no rift.
I thought I heard you earlier say that you did not believe Benazir Bhutto's letter from the grave that said, in the event of my death, please blame Musharraf. I think I heard you say that Musharraf, in your opinion, is not to blame.
Well, I think there are two senses of the word blame. She had, and two senses of the word responsible as well. She had said that the protection that she'd wanted from him, the level of protection that she felt she was entitled to which she felt she was entitled, I should say, had not been forthcoming, and that was in itself culpable. But I don't think she meant it to be, and I didn't read the letter as meaning that the Musharraf regime was trying to organize or bring about her death.
Well, there has been ongoing criticism for not protecting him.
Yes, absolutely. But I mean, as I say to someone who admires her and who's seen her do it, if you will suddenly push back the sunroof of your car and protrude yourself through the top in these circumstances, I mean, it is a very rash thing to have been doing. I don't make her the author of her own death by saying that. I have seen her and heard her say many, many times before she returned that it was the Al-Qaeda and Islamist forces that were hoping to kill her.
Let me thank Debbie for the call.
I think that distinction is worth making. I don't think the Musharraf government is blameless, but I don't think that it was the author of her assassination.
Mohammed, our next caller, welcome.
Hey, thank you for having me on, Dr. President. I hope to be starting an internship soon with Forum. My question for Mr. Hitchens is, you say in your book that you hate all religions equally. And I was wondering, among the three monotheistic faiths, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, which one do you think presents a stronger argument for the existence of God?
Well, I think they're all equally fallacious in that respect.
Do you think one can prove better than the other that there is a God, or do you think they're all equally?
No, I think that assumption is equally weak, whoever makes it. Whether it's a Quaker or whether it's a member of the Muqtada Sadr's Mahdi army, it's just as fatuous to assume that we are here because of a divine plan rather than because of the laws of evolution via natural selection.
Mohammed, thank you for the call. On we go. Chuck, you're on.
Thanks a lot. I guess just on that subject, I think that there are some people, perhaps myself included, who see in those natural laws the hand of God, and therefore there is no real supernatural as distinct from the natural. But that's not what I called about. I called because I think Mr. Hitchens is making what I hear the same dangerous mistake that a lot of people make with regards to the Iraq War, which my feeling about was if you're going to do it, you should do it right. And my main criticisms have been about all the ways in which we've kind of messed it up. But he seems to emphasize the military aspect about defeats of Al-Qaeda and the rejection of Al-Qaeda by elements of the Iraqi population, which are fine things. But I think even George Bush would tell you that the real threat of Al-Qaeda and so-called Islamofascism is an ideological one, and the warfare is basically asymmetrical, so that these military defeats, I think, are of less importance than the rise of the ideology of Al-Qaeda and anti-Americanism and recruiting for that cause, and therefore when you reckon the costs and benefits of the Iraq War, it becomes a lot more difficult than just military defeats for the American military can defeat pretty much anybody.
Well, I don't have a rooted disagreement with what you say, and I could tell you things about the mismanagement of the war that would curl your hair. But I think I was careful to say in my first reply to Mike that it wasn't just the battlefield defeat inflicted on Al-Qaeda, the terrible casualties that they've had to absorb. It was the discredit that they've had to undergo in the majority Sunni provinces where they had begun to try and set up an alternative government, a so-called Islamic Republic in Bakuba, and had revealed themselves as sadistic, incompetent, intolerant, corrupt, vicious, very largely foreign-run, and in other words, had thoroughly alienated the Iraqi population, so that it was a political defeat for them as well as a military one. I hope I made that plain.
Let me thank the caller. We have come to the end of the hour. I want to mention Christopher Hitchens' books again, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, and The Portable Atheist, Essential Readings for the Non-Believer. He writes for Slate and is contributing editor, The Atlantic Monthly and Vanity Fair. Always good to have you on.
Very nice of you to have me again.
I thank you. Here's a question for you from a listener as we go out. How do you celebrate New Year's Eve? And he says, Happy New Year's, which I'll say to our listeners. What do you do?
I'll be on a plane tonight to London, so I won't know what time the balloon drops.
Well, good flying.
Or I won't know what time it is where I am.
Understood. But I wish you a Happy New Year nonetheless, and
Thank
to my
you.
listeners as well. We
Yes,
thank
and
you
to all
for
of
being
you.
with us.